I get anxiety attacks, bad ones, that consume me for 1, 2, 3 days at a time. And I'm just getting over one at the moment that happened this week. One of the most difficult things for me about these anxiety attacks is I feel so isolated when they're happening and even afterwards. I know that lots of other people get anxiety attacks, but it feels to me that the worries that are driving mine are really different from other people's. If I try, as I have been doing, to pull apart some of what was going on for the last one, underneath it are questions like, what if people don't listen to me because they don't realise I'm an expert? What if they listen to me when I'm not being an expert? What if they listen to me just because I have a soothing voice? What if they listen to me without realising the limitations of my experting? What if no one ever realises that I'm an expert? What if they do? What if I'm the only one worrying about all of this? And so I thought I would try and unpack some of the backstory behind this in the hope that maybe one day I'll be able to talk to people about what's going on for me during these attacks. But on the other hand, I have a sneaking suspicion that if I ever get to the point where I've explained the full backstory, I might not get them at all in the first place. So sit back, enjoy, and here's a bit of Ruth's story. This story starts with the question, how do you become an expert? And I'm very much in the camp that agrees with the view put forward by Erickson, that one of the key components is intense practice for a minimum of 10 years. Now, just to clarify a few points about this, the 10 years is an average. It's not you wake up overnight on year 10 and suddenly you're an expert. It's not saying that this is the only thing and that there is no role for natural ability or genetic factors. And it's also, and probably the most important part of it, is the deliberate in front of the practice, not the amount of times. And I notice they use the word intense practice here as well. One of the interesting things I found about this paper is they have a section discussing the role of napping in the development of expert performance. The argument being that the deliberate practice is so intense that the students need extra sleep time to recover from it by napping in the afternoon. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately, starting from sometime last year, where I've started to find myself thinking more and more that maybe I didn't want to think of myself as a student with potential anymore, and maybe it was time I started thinking of myself as an expert, and maybe I wanted other people to see me that way too. And when I started looking back and counting the years since I started my PhD and started getting really interested in teaching and learning, sure enough, it did turn out to be pretty much bang on 10 years. And so I set myself a goal that I wanted to become an expert. Now, this might seem a strange goal to have. Maybe you think that you do the 10 years and then you're an expert. But for me, I think there's a distinction between almost experts who know a lot of stuff and experts who can say, I am an expert in blah because blah, blah, blah. Experts know what they're an expert in, and by definition, therefore, what they're not an expert in, and they know that they've got the competencies to do that. For example, you can't be a medical doctor who doesn't know CPR. Now, if you're a medical doctor, a paramedic, an architect, lots of other professions, working out what you're an expert in isn't really that tricky. It's kind of printed on your degree qualification. But for other people like me, who've sort of developed our own path to becoming an expert, the biggest part of becoming an expert is just figuring out what sort of expert we actually are. So this is a question I've been thinking about for ages, with not a whole lot of success. But recently I was thinking maybe it'd be helpful to go back to what I thought before I started my PhD and see if I can compare what I was like then to what I'm like now, and the difference could be what sort of expert I am. So this is a picture I drew pretty early on in my PhD, trying to capture my motivations for starting it. And it started from a place of me having no understanding of why physics that made so much sense to me made absolutely no sense to everyone else. And this is another picture I drew, in this case 9 years ago, capturing what I felt like when I started doing my first analysis of the interviews I've been conducting. Here I represented myself in the middle of a dark, dense forest, and it's my job to try and map it. But that wasn't difficult enough to capture what I was feeling, and so this forest is chock-a-block of hidden wormholes that will transport you to a completely different area of the forest without you even realising that's happened, which makes the mapping exercise a little bit tricky. So, how does that compare to where I am now? Well, first of all, I know a lot about the thoughts that a lot of people are thinking when they see F equals MA. They go like, I'm too stupid. I can't do maths. Please don't ask me a question. Everyone will think I'm stupid. I'm the only one who doesn't get this. What will my parents think if I fail? I have no idea what it means, so I better memorize it. Which is very surprising to me and not at all what I was expecting, because this has got nothing to do with Newton's laws at all. But it does kind of explain why these people don't make sense of the physics, because what they're thinking has got nothing to do with making sense of the equation. This is not deliberate practice, people. So maybe I was onto something when I first thought of myself as trying to be a map maker. What if I think of myself as a map maker of thoughts and feelings around learning? And here the feelings bit is really important. That's not something I expected to be mapping when I started, but as I tried to understand things like what people are thinking when they read F equals MA, I realised you can't understand it without including the feelings. Let's assume I'm a map maker of thoughts and feelings. What sort of expert skills have I developed in order to be able to do that? Well, first of all, you start by getting someone and asking them to tell you what they're thinking and feeling. And what you quickly learn is what they actually say sounds a lot like this. Idea 1, idea 2, idea 3, back to idea 1, idea 4, back to idea 3, back to idea 1, more on idea 3, and so on for half an hour or more. And so the first map maker skill you need is to be able to take this sort of conversation, we call it an interview, and process it to actually sort out what they're on about. So you take all the stuff from idea 1 and put it together, all the stuff about idea 2 and put that together, so on and so forth. When you first start doing this, you look at your summary and you realise something. There's often a lot of interesting things that they didn't actually end up telling you much about. And then you realise something. That's what you're meant to be doing during the interview, is noticing that they introduced idea 2 that's really interesting and didn't tell you much about it, so you can pull them back to it and ask them to tell you more. So what you've actually developed the ability to do is do at least some of that pre-processing in your head automatically during the interview, so you can spot the things that you need to ask them more about. I'll also point out that when you do this, your interviews start going on for probably twice as long. So most of mine are now an hour or more instead of half an hour or more. Once you've got a bunch of data on someone's thoughts and feelings and haven't got any massive gaps, the analysis can start in earnest. And basically, this means making a lot of comparisons. You can compare all the different thoughts they had about an idea, and you can do the same for feelings. You can compare all the thoughts to all the feelings. And you can compare the thoughts and feelings about one idea to the thoughts and feelings about another. And all of that was just for the data from a single interview from a single person. You can interview multiple people and compare what they say. The ones I've told you about so far, I tend to think of as the basic mechanics. The ones I'm moving on to are my favourite ones, which is where the insights tend to pop up. One of the things you can do is take a single thought and show it to lots of people and ask them how they interpret it. And what you tend to find is they all interpret it differently. And this is where you realise that you're making massive assumptions about what's going on. You may have also been wondering where I got these idea 1, idea 2, idea 3 and idea 4 from. And that's a very good question. I think about this question a lot, basically comparing the analysis I've completed with the current categories to what I think it might look like if I group them according to idea 1A, 2A, 3A and 4A instead. And sometimes I realise it'll make a massive difference. And depending on how I'm feeling, I might either describe this as a big breakthrough or a whole lot of more work. One of the big ones for me is that when people are talking about learning, it's very easy to group what they're saying according to the thing that they're learning. But what I've found time and time again when I do my analyses is that you get so many more interesting insights if you group them according to whether the person was being an effective learner and an ineffective learner. There are so many more things in common with how effective learners approach different subjects than there are in how effective learners and ineffective learners approach the same subject. A final thing that I'm particularly interested in my analyses is how we make connections between different ideas and how those connections are so crucial to the way we learn and make sense of the world. To get what I mean, try and put yourself back in the shoes of a young child learning to read for the first time. One of the difficulties that they have to deal with is that the letter A can look like a capital A and a lowercase a, which look completely different. The same with B, the same with D. C, not so bad. And then they also have to learn that lowercase b and lowercase d, which in many ways look really similar, are actually completely different. Think about how much cognitive processing is going on making sense of even a simple sentence like a bad dad ... We can sort of, when we think about it like this, appreciate intellectually why it would be difficult, but to experience it, to imagine yourself in a world where those connections don't happen automatically, where just that simple sentence requires all of your cognitive power, there's nothing in our brain that can simulate that, because it is impossible for us to look back and somehow imagine what it's like to see the letter lowercase b and not connect it to uppercase B. So one of the things I do in my analyses is try to make sense of the differences between effective and ineffective learners as being about often the same ideas, but the ineffective learners see them in a fragmented way, whereas the effective learners see them in a much more connected way. They're often thinking about the same ideas, but the ineffective learners can think about idea 1 without seeing any connection to idea 2, where that would be basically inconceivable for the effective learners, in the same way that it's almost inconceivable for us to imagine seeing an uppercase A and not also seeing a connection to lowercase a. So when you start mapping it out like that, you can then zoom in on the connections themselves and start making comparisons between different connections, or between the really strong connections that you'd see in the most effective learners and the weaker connection you might see in a moderately effective learner. At this point, you're probably noticing that there's a lot of comparisons going on. So it won't surprise you to hear that the methodology I use to do the analysis, grounded theory, is often referred to as the method of constant comparisons, because that's pretty much what it is. Once I've done at least some form of analysis, I can start drawing some maps. I can draw sketch maps early on to capture one or maybe two ideas as they're starting to emerge. Or I can draw large, complicated maps that string together how lots of the ideas fit together. I should say that I just made this one up as an example for this video, but it actually sounds kind of cool, so maybe one day I should do it. I can make my maps in many different forms. I can use everyday words and pictures for anyone who's interested in becoming a more effective learner. I can annotate these stories for teachers, explaining the teaching ideas that are doing the heavy lifting in the background. And for scholars, I can explain the grounded theory behind this and the methodology and evidence that led to what I'm saying. And alongside all of that, I'm a storyteller. And I like telling my own stories, which always seem to involve me still being lost, despite having all these maps. And usually, eventually, finding myself in unexpected places on my maps. And I guess that is kind of the point, because if I'd showed up in expected places, I wouldn't have been lost in the first place. So, has all of this got me anywhere? Am I any closer to writing my I am an expert statement? What have we got? I am an expert in mapping the thoughts and feelings of effective and ineffective learners and using the maps to guide learners, because all of the stuff I just said. I don't know. It's getting there? Maybe not quite, but it's a start. I wonder if anyone's interested in listening to that sort of expert. Maybe I should ask them. Probably it won't work for the people looking for an expert who writes papers. I think I probably need to translate it into the sort of words they understand. And, well, am I really that sort of expert? I've not actually written the paper yet, or finished the teaching guide. Probably feel a bit better if I'd actually done that. This, somehow, is not the video that I expected to make when I started. Somewhere it stopped being the backstory to an anxiety attack, and seems to have become a becoming an expert to-do list. I'm not sure what happened. I think I need to think about it some more and see how I feel. Anyone got any thoughts?